Yes.
All right. So it's always a pleasure to be able to present. Lauren gave me a great introduction. I've been a lot of places. I've learned a lot. When I started at the Kerr Center, I was a kind of a consultant in the animal science field, but I got to run around with some forage specialists, some ag economists, and even horticulture. And so it led me to great training into basically what we're talking about today as far as multi-species grazing. The Kerr Center kind of utilized a little bit of multi-species grazing. And so I'm going to just kind of go over some overview and maybe some other guidelines. I think Lauren talked about we were supposed to have another speaker, and I think you just get me tonight. So, feel free to ask questions as we go, because it's definitely something I don't plan on talking for a long amount of time. And so, again, I appreciate this opportunity. So with that, kind of my thoughts on what we were going to try to accomplish tonight is maybe share some experiences that I may have had at the Kerr Center, but also run into some kind of research guidelines that doing a quick search for multi-species grazing. Atra.org is a sustainable ag kind of warehouse that talks about multi-species grazing. And so that one is a great document to kind of get some background information if you want to do further reading. And I, of course, looked at other universities to see if they had anything written on it. And South Dakota State did have an article on multi-species grazing. California, Chico was another one that had a nice little article kind of describing what multi-species grazing is. And then, of course, the Kerr Center, my fellow co-workers there have put together some fact sheets on this topic as well. So we want to kind of talk about the benefits, the positive impacts on the ecology that it could promote for your farm, the grazing dynamics. Is there some synergistic aspects of raising chickens with cattle, with pigs, what have you? And so typically the big hurdle to overcome a lot of times for people when we think about multi-species grazing is a lot of times looking at that goat that's in this picture, and how do I keep that goat in and feel comfortable at night going to bed knowing that it'll stay in. And so those are always challenges, but it can be overcome. Predators. We run an Oklahoma forage buck test in Wilburton, Oklahoma, and last year they reported that there was a mountain lion in the vicinity, and so that always makes me a little bit nervous when people bring their goats to a location in Oklahoma, and I've got to worry about maybe one of those apex predators, if you will. Some of the things you got to think about when you talk about multi-species grazing is, what mineral supplements, one might be good for cattle, but it may not be very good for sheep. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Parasites are always a big key item to discuss, and especially in goats, sheep, they tend to be the ones that have the biggest challenge of surviving when you have parasite burdens out there in the pasture. Parasites love warm, wet temperatures, and so here we are kind of getting some July rainfalls, and so parasite loads will probably go up. So always be aware of what tools you can use in a multi-species grazing situation, and hopefully we'll talk about some vegetation management and stocking rate decisions as well. So that's a pretty long list on my introductory slide. I promise you the rest of this presentation will go a little bit quicker. So let's define maybe a stocking rate. Our plant and soil scientists, PSS-2871 is our fact sheet for stocking rate. It's an excellent document to become familiar with and search for. But basically, throughout history, we've kind of defined one animal unit as a 1,000-pound cow with her calf at her side. And that one animal unit will eat about 26 pounds of dry matter. So that animal unit AUD is the animal unit day. And so if we multiply that 26 pounds by 30 days in a month, we get that 780 pounds is what one animal unit will eat in a month's time. And then the animal unit year, obviously, times 365, we're going to have over 9,000 pounds of forage that animal unit's going to require. So I also have a caption of different species. Obviously, we're not going to be grazing fish, but you know, how does one cow compare to fish? One cow compare to goats, one cow compare to sheep, and one cow to a horse. And basically, we're comparing them on an animal unit basis and equivalent on their favorite eating energy requirements. And so that's kind of how we can say there's takes 5 sheep to equal 1 cow and 7 goats to equal 1 cow. 2 tools of grazing management that really probably need to be defined, and that's one of those things that we want to look at as far as forage availability. How much forage do I have out there right now? And we can think about it like pouring a bag of feed into a trough. That's how much forage is out there for those animals to eat on a daily basis. So it's our pounds of dry matter per acre that we want to kind of estimate sometimes. And we can look at this chart here where it shows the different grazing paddocks, if you will. At number 1, if that grass is only a couple inches high, we can say multiply that by 300 pounds per inch. So if it's only 300 pounds per inch, and that's 2 inches height, on the average, we've only got 600 pounds of actual dry matter for that animal to eat. Whereas paddock number 3, we've got a lot more forage there for those animals to consume, and we can go out there and estimate what our forage availability is. And so June, July are kind of some excellent times to go out there and kind of evaluate your forages. I know when I moved to Oklahoma, that's kind of what I did to learn, was to go out and measure the pastures at each month, say the 15th of each month, and just kind of see how much growth I do have in this area compared to South Dakota. And so stock density is another term we want to think about. It's the pounds of animals per acre for a day. So we could have 100 cows on 1 acre. That's going to be some pretty high stock density for that particular day and acreage there. And so when you do high stock density, the animals tend to graze with less selection. So high stock density makes them eat weeds and so forth. But the problem with that is we've got to have a lot of different paddocks to rotate them through, because they're gonna graze that out pretty quickly. So there's always kind of pluses and minuses when you talk about rotational grazing and knowing your tools there a little bit. Species preference. So I'm going to focus in on cattle, sheep, and goats. In this chart, they do overlap on certain things like grass, for example, but realize that cattle do consume about 70% of their diet as a grass species. That's what they're going to go out there and select for. Forbs is going to be equal in amounts, so there might be something like ragweed that's very tasty for them on a certain day, but over time, really, they're not going to eat that much of that. Browse are going to be your woodier species, so it makes sense that goats tend to eat things at kind of their eye level, and will actually crawl up on their front feet to reach up into the tree limbs to actually graze or harvest on those particular plants, whereas forbs are kind of more of the sheep's area of interest, and so they may eat a little bit differently and eat a few more forbs than they would the browse, and obviously they will eat grass as well. Now, if you've sprayed a piece of pasture and all there is out there to eat is grass, those goats sure enough will get hungry enough and they'll eat grass as well. But just realize their inherent nature is to eat different species of plant material out there, and there is some overlap there. So when we think about multi-species grazing, it makes sense that we might, if we've got a cattle operation, goats may be a good thing to incorporate it into an operation and diversify that income. So if we think about that grassy pasture, this has actually been a study by University of Idaho, Karen Lunchbaugh, where she kind of looked at the forage species or plant species that was in a particular pasture And in this particular case, there was more grass out there, so it met the cattle's diet a lot more easily. At 94% of that pasture met the cattle's need, whereas the similarity between pasture and sheep diet was a little bit less, and so at 83%. So, you know, goats wouldn't fit on this particular pasture as well because that's not their preferred plant material. But if we do look at shrubby pasture or those browse specific pastures, and that's the thing. Even in my own operation, I've got pastures that have got more grass in it, and then I've got more some other pastures that have got more browse in it. And Dr. Sparks always liked to say, you know, look out in those pastures and see what's out there. And so if you want to do a lead follow situation, if there's more browse out there, you turn the goats out first. If there's more grass out there, you turn the cattle out first, and then follow up with the other species to kind of keep those pastures in check. So I thought this was a neat study to kind of visually describe maybe something that you can kind of look at out there in the pasture. So I mentioned lead follow. Again, if we think about, we've got 6 to 8 different paddocks, and we've got cattle, sheep, and goats, and we go out there and look, and we see that we've got more browse than we do grass. We're going to turn those goats out first into that one pasture, and then we're going to follow it up with sheep, and then finally with the cattle on the grass species. If we do just continuously graze, we open up the gate for all 3 of those species to go out there. We tend to see the best animal performance depending on how much forage is out there. There's less time and expense in that situation. There's no allowance for deferment, though. Those animals are going to go out there, and they're going to be the ones in control of what they select. So we tend to see the forage base maybe change from more preferred species of material to less preferred, where say like woolly croton, that's a weed that we tend to see crop up, especially in drought years, and they sometimes call it goat weed, and even that plant, even the goats won't eat. So it's kind of a misnomer of why we would want to call it goat weed when even the goats won't eat it. So knowledge of plant growth, plants' response to grazing is critical to grazing management decision processes. You know, one of the things we can do with that lead follow or any rotational grazing, we do allow those forages to rest. We get increased management flexibility. With that, the legumes have a better chance of performing because they kind of get equal chances of sunlight, versus if you do continuous grazing, that may be the preferred species that all 3 of those species eat, and they may graze them out, and you kind of lose your legume stand or clover stand. So grass growth, I think we ought to think about comparison of forage production under continuous versus rotational grazing. And so on a 1-day forage production, we can get somewhere around 58 pounds of dry matter per acre if we rotate through pastures on a 1-day rotation. So, you know, that's a lot of work. We don't seem to get as much growth out of that kind of rotational system, but notice that it is quite a bit more than the continuous grazing system at the bottom at 37 pounds. So there's always a fine line on what we want to do there. 3 days, 7 days, 21 days rotation. You know, we can allow for different grass growth on different species. This happens to be on, I believe, Bahia grass, a 21-day resting period between the grazing periods that was done by the University of Florida. So the forage growth kind of curve on the right in the blue chart there, the best time to graze is just allow that grass to grow to a certain height that allows it to kind of optimize its solar panel collection to transfer that energy into its grass growth, not only in the leaf material, but also in the vegetation along the soil line and also the root growth. So if we were to continuously graze, that animal may come back there and re-graze that freshly grazed plant material from the day before, and it's going to weaken that root stand. And so we always kind of want to be somewhere in the middle where we optimize our yield and also the quality of that plant material that goes into that animal. So what is an ideal grazing system? It still is a question mark when you say ideal, and it can be from the north to the south in the US, and it can be from the east to the west. A lot of factors kind of play into this. What kind of animals are we grazing those paddocks? Are we dealing with dairy cattle, or that it needs really high quality forages, or are we dealing with goats that can get by on those forage material? And so how much a plant rests, for example, a native grass tends to need a lot longer rest period. Kind of a rule of thumb is 45 days rest period for things like big blue stem switchgrass. Whereas Bermuda grass and maybe even fescue, we can get by with a 21-day rest period. So, if you at least take a continuous graze system and split it into half, at least you're going to be resting it for half the period. And so there is always going to be a law of diminishing returns. Once we get past 24 paddocks, the cost of that extra fencing may not give us much more reward on the rest period involved in that. This happens to be a picture in 2007. I moved to Oklahoma in 1995, worked with this producer over many years. We set up a rotational grazing system, and in March of 2007, it was a really dry winter, and March usually is one of those years where we think about having lots of forage growth and lots of water in the pond. Well, this particular year, we were saying the same picture of a pond there, and that same fence post, and one was in March and one was in July. So we actually got some late kind of spring and early summer rains, and you can't always dictate when you're going to get those rains, but having a rotational grazing system allows those plants to rest over a long period of time. And when we do get the rains, then we tend to capitalize on that. So rest the pasture, the strengthens the plant, increases storage of carbohydrates in the roots. It allows regrowth. We can increase plant vigor then. And then also by having that rotational grazing system, we don't talk about it probably enough, is that grazing distribution kind of dictates the fecal material that gets placed on our pastures, and so it gets distributed a lot better in a rotational grazing system. So we're kind of improving our farm efficiency through grazing management. We waste less grass, we increase our gain per acre. Typically the gain per animal goes down, but our gain per acre is usually the measure we're looking at in a rotational grazing system. One of the other grazing challenges, I think, for me moving to Oklahoma was what type of forages are available. Bermuda grass, I was told when I left South Dakota, you'll run into Bermuda grass, and that's held up true. Fescue in the eastern part of the state is very common, whereas in the western part of the state, we're still trying to find varieties that will work in those more extreme, drier climates. So we've got a warm season grass in Bermuda grass that does well from May through September, basically. And then if we can grow tall fescue, we could fill in those voids there in the early spring and late in the fall to kind of give us more of a season-long grazing period. So always think about what forages you do have available. I listed southern forages there as kind of my Bible to go back on and read about the different grass species that are available. So I'd always recommend purchasing that book on Amazon if you can, to learn about the different grass species that are available. Legend Lespedeza was one of those kind of new species varieties that was released by Arkansas. So it really kind of fit the warm season environment for a legume plant. Usually our Oklahoma weathers kind of make a lot of those legumes go dormant and look like they're basically, dead in July and August. But something like Legend Lespedeza is a warm season legume, and so that one could fit a niche area as well. So I'm always looking for a cool season grass, a cool season legume, a warm season legume, and a warm season grass component, and that kind of helps fill out the entire year if we can. So multi-species grazing. I've got some leased land. The fence on that property is not the best, as you can imagine. Most leased properties, they'll keep fences up where it kind of gets by. You don't always want to put a lot of money in unless you've got a real good scenario with that lease where you kind of share in some of those decisions. And so electric fencing has kind of been the cheapest form of increasing the number of pastures we could have in any particular piece of property. Even in my lease property, I went ahead and put single strand electric fence and tried to cross divide those pastures to take advantage of my grazing management. So in this particular picture, we're showing where you've almost got like a field fence on the bottom end, and then some electric fence on the top end, or it could be barbed wire. And so these are things that you want to consider when you think about multi-species grazing. We definitely want to have a very good perimeter fence, so we feel comfortable if we have a high traffic road that we live on, those kinds of things. And the key to an electric fence is going to be those energizers. We typically don't see those at our local farm supply stores. We may have to order those to feel really comfortable on keeping, say, goats in. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The thing I see most people have trouble with is that we don't supply enough actual grounding based on that size of that energizer that's being placed out there. When we get into July and August, the ground dries up. There's not as good a contact with that ground rod. And so, that electric fencer all of a sudden was reading 5,000 volts, and now it's maybe 2,000 volts. And that's one of the problems of keeping animals in. We've got to make sure we keep up the voltage for the worst kind of scenario or conditions. So what do animals kind of require to stay in an electric fence situation? Kind of the bare minimums, 2,000 volts for pigs. And I kind of grew up grazing some pigs in a situation in Iowa, and we'd have a one strand electric down at the bottom of a fence, of a barbed wire fence. And that wasn't always all about voltage. You may have to put rings in those pigs' noses to make sure they actually get contact with that electric fence. Cattle tend to be fairly low at 2,000 to 3,000 volts, whereas sheep 4,000 volts, and then goats, we kind of say a minimum of 5,000 volts to keep them in. And so those are just some guidelines to go off of. And then the next question people ask, well, how far off the ground does that electric fence need to be? And obviously there's netting that's out there that's available, and usually they set them at 12-inch spacings, and 40-inch height is kind of the standard. I would like to see on goats, probably you're going to need to have another strand there at that 6-inch height, at least to get them to raise their head up and maybe touch that 12-inch if you wanted to have a ground typical wire at that 6-inch height as well. So cost, what I went back and tried to look at what it does cost to put say an 80-acre pasture in perimeter fencing. If we just went five wire barbed wire around that, what would it cost to put that in just material alone, and do a comparison there. And so at today's prices, you're going to have to invest in T-posts. You're going to have to invest in actual corners and those kinds of things. So most of those are all going to be needed for an electric fence versus a barbed wire fence. When we go ahead and put that on a square foot basis, today's cost, it runs around five wire barbed wire fence is going to run $1.30 to maybe $1.50 these days. And so how is that in comparison to an electric fence then? And so I've actually looked into, in the goat test, we had a company kind of offer this type of fencing, which is a high tensile woven wire that actually can be electrified. Those posts in this picture are kind of a composite post. So all you have to do is kind of make a cotter key to hold that fence up. And that is actually energized. And those goats would actually touch an electric shock if they were to get into that fence. And kind of the key to this particular fence is you'll notice that those spacings are a lot wider than most woven wire fence that you get at most stores. So there's like 24 inches in there. And how do we keep animals in? Well, it's either a physical barrier or a mental barrier. So that electric fence, once they get shocked by that, that's part of that mental barrier. So if we compare this now on the price there, we've got about the same amount in a good electrified fence than when we would have spent for that five wires barbed wire fence in material. The only thing now is we didn't pay for that energizer there. Some other items to consider when you think about multi-species grazing, and we're thinking about maybe a cattle operation to incorporating some goats or sheep. You know, there are some equipment out there that we can utilize for both species, and a calf table is one of those that I know we've used to do things like measure a ribeye area on a goat, for example. We've used that preferred calf table to kind of hold them steady and let that ultrasound technician get his measurements. This Filson calf table, I've had some experience with that one. You can kind of turn that one both directions. It's a pretty neat deal, whereas that preferred can only go basically to the left there. At our working facilities, cattle operations, if we put goats or sheep into that tub, yeah, we probably could run some animals through there, but we really need a system that kind of fits the animals that we do have there. And so you might think about, how can I incorporate a small ruminant species into an existing cattle operation? The picture with the cattle operation is a bud box. This is going into a facility where we're going to capture that animal in a head gate system, and bud boxes have become very popular. Whereas the tub system for the sheep and the goats, it's very similar in nature, but at least in that particular scenario, we've kind of using that tub as a catch area too. I always suggest in cattle operations, never put more animals in that tub system than can fit in that alleyway. So this picture is showing those sheep kind of crammed up in there pretty tightly. And I would probably recommend only, taking 2/3 of those animals out of that scenario, so they feel a little bit more comfortable when you do work those animals. Hay feeders, there's a lot of advantages to certain types of feeders and disadvantage to others. We can buy some cheap hay feeders that are, easily found at most stores, and we're going to get X amount of loss in those. Dr. Lallman's done a great study with some grad students looking at the different hay feeder types. So this one in this particular is a modified basket. Those cattle can go up there and they can grab that hay, but when they do grab it, it sometimes falls right back into that bottom ring there. And so we tend to see less loss in a system like that. Goats and sheep tend to do very similar things, but if you put a hay bale out there, I've noticed that they'll eat right out of the middle of a hay. And we've actually lost some goats where, they get in the middle of that and then all of a sudden it collapses on them. So, hay feeders are something to consider in all species. And I'm not sure I've found a great one yet for goats and sheep, but they keep working on them. So I talked about minerals being a concern. If we think about a mineral that's designed for cattle, it may have a certain level of copper in it. And sheep tend to be one of those animals that are most susceptible to higher levels of copper. And so in a calf, maybe all we see is a hair coat, a rough hair coat, or kind of a off color on black-hided cattle that's more brown. And we can actually kind of see some symptoms there. Maybe they don't shed off their winter hair coat quite as easy. And we can see some copper deficiencies in those cattle. Whereas at that level they've been fed, that can be very toxic to a sheep. And so we've got to be careful of knowing which minerals to feed in a multi-species operation. Maybe one of the signs on a goat could be, abnormal hoof growth in this particular picture. You think that's maybe just one of those genetic conditions, but it could very well be something that's correlated to the mineral package that we're providing. Maybe excess or even a deficiency. I kind of doing my research on this topic, it was kind of neat to come across this one in 1985 that talked about opportunities to increase multi-species grazing. And in this case, they said the Eastern U.S. for a symposium held in Arkansas. And Oklahoma is definitely listed on here. That shaded area probably could be expanded quite a bit more than this particular author suggests, but there's definitely opportunities in the U.S. to do multi-species grazing. So what other tools can I offer you tonight? One of the things that I did on any situation is look at the web soil survey tool that's available in every state. It kind of tells you about the soil types you have in your operation, and it can kind of tell you kind of the production within a specific state or location. And so this happens to be Eastern's facility where they used to raise their swine operation, and we converted it into the goat test. And so there were 16 acres. We kind of put some fencing around that. It's kind of a mesh fence on the perimeter. And we kind of rotate those goats through these different paddocks. And I used this web soil survey tool to estimate how many animals we could actually stock. And, you think about it like if you're buying a set of ewes or does in a small ruminant package, how many can I run for a year? And knowing that these are kind of weaned animals, I'm only going to have them there for about an 84-day test period. So I can kind of stock at a similar rate to what we'd stock for a normal year-long period, because this is going to have a lot more rest between our test periods here. So I took the information that was provided on the web soil survey and came up with about 54 heads for an 80-day test. And that's actually what has worked very well for us. We actually run 56 head is our quota that we run on this test. And it served us very well until last year when that drought was very severe. And we ended up for the first time ever in my career, 15 plus years, where we actually had to add a little corn to meet the needs of those animals based off of the forage growth that just didn't happen. One of the tools on that web soil survey is if you're thinking about planting a different forage, this can give you a good idea, okay, within this particular piece of land, which one actually has the highest rating. And I hope on that paddock 1, you'll see that it says 5.68 animal units of Bermuda, 4.18 animal units of fescue, and 0.27 animal units of blue stem. So if I was to go out there and plant blue stem, that would have been the worst rating I could have done. And it makes sense to maybe target that pasture number 1 to be a Bermuda grass pasture. It has the highest rating for that. So just one of those unique tools that we can rely on and kind of get a guidance on. I know on my own piece of property, I've got a section on my land that really favors fescue. So I would suggest utilizing this tool if you don't feel comfortable finding the information. Most of our educators have been trained in this tool and can be very helpful in this. So in conclusion, why multi-species grazing requires more thought and management and more investment in facilities, like say, having 2 facilities for one for cattle and one for goats to just work them. It can have some big payoffs for the pasture in your wallet, because you can diversify your income throughout the year. So a lot of times if cattle are high priced, goats and sheep may not be, but in the opposite years, it may be the goats and sheep that actually have the high prices for those particular years, and that diversity kind of helps improve the sustainability of your operation. I talked a lot about grazing, so keeping weedy species down, and it's always going to be one of those things where stocking rates are always going to be one of those critical areas that you kind of figure out. So, if you've had 100 cows over the years and you want to add sheep or goats, we're going to have to go back to our original slide where we're going to figure out, okay, if I take 1 cow away, that equals 5 to 7 sheep and goats. That's where we need to think about selecting a stocking rate based on the whole enterprise. Anytime we deal with different species, we want to make sure we select healthy stock. I've talked about parasites. That is one of the aspects of our goat test, where we're actually measuring which animals kind of have some inherent resistance to parasites. And so selecting off of those tests can be very important to an operation. And our dewormers, we're not getting companies to give us new dewormers every year. We've kind of got what we've got there, and so we've got to be good stewards of the products we have. And so dewormer resistance is a sure enough real thing. And so we want to make sure we can be observant of our livestock, find a way to measure animals that are kind of resistant as well in that. So I think, Lauren, with that, this was going to be a pretty short, because I think we were supposed to have 2 speakers tonight. Hopefully I didn't go too long for you there. But we also talked about maybe stumping the expert as well. So we'll allow some extra time for questions, if we will.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, we won't have our second speaker tonight. So Brian has agreed. If anybody has any questions, please ask them now. If you want to turn on your microphone, or you can put them in the chat. Well, we got some extra time, so just go ahead and throw them out.
I'm going to rely on you, Lauren, to do the chat if there's anything that comes through there. That way we're not both clicking on that. So Lauren, I think you've got some multi-species animals on your own property, don't you? And so I know I didn't talk a lot about chickens tonight. I think, is that true that you've got a little bit of a chicken operation as well?
Yes.
Yeah. And so one of the things that like a chicken tractor following a cattle operation, they can break up those manure patties and break up that fly cycle, and they can fit a nice niche there in a multi-species operation.
Okay, looks like we got a couple of questions. Let's see. Okay, like to hear more about water and the best way to get water to the paddocks. Can you say anything about that, Brian?
Sure. So I didn't spend a lot of time on that in this presentation, but to me, that is one of the critical elements. Water to livestock in the summertime is very critical, isn't it? So the producer I showed with the pond, in March versus July, where it was, really dried down, he kind of fenced off that pond, and we incorporated his spraying money for the year into water development to have a well water that can disseminate water to the different paddocks. So that is one option that you can do. That same producer, he just really believed in having alternatives to water sources. So he had a 2-inch hose on the back of a truck that had a kind of a temporary water tank, and he could move around if he needed to, if there was a problem with that well or a pond that went dry. And so, you know, on a day-to-day basis, he could fill that truck up, and he could move to any pasture he wanted to. And that's more of a temporary item, but we can sure do portable watering systems. You know, I like having say a well that you can kind of rely on, or even rural water that gets a little more expensive, but that well that we can put some pipe under the ground and have kind of risers where we can kind of click into to move a stock tank around. When you typically graze animals on a little bit closer units or high stock density, they tend to go to water on an individual basis. University of Missouri did a great study where distance to water dictated how many animals would go to that water. So anytime you get 1,000 feet or more from a water source, they tend to go as a group. So if you can stay under that kind of threshold, you know, one animal going to a stock tank, it's going to maybe drink 10 gallons. All right. And so it has a lot easier chance of recharging for the rest of the herd if that happens to be the case. Whereas, you know, if it's a mile to water, maybe the whole group goes there and they all try to gather around that water trough at the same time, and that you know, pump may not keep up with that activity. So hopefully I answered that a little bit.
Okay, we have one more. Using diatomaceous earth for warming.
That's a common question that gets asked. There's definitely people that swear by it. The problem for us, for me and Lauren, is that in extension, we typically talk about research-based information, and we've yet to find somebody to do a controlled study where we see a benefit to the diatomaceous earth and helping out with that scenario. So again, probably going to be a case-by-case basis. You know, that's not an area of research that gets funded quite a bit, so it may be a tough one to answer for everybody's liking, I guess, if you will.
Okay, that's all the questions in the chat. Does anybody have anything else? Okay.
This is Mike Gibbons. I have one quick question. If you were going to do doing the lead follow method, how far behind your ruminants would you bring in chickens in order to kind of break that pest cycle and the fly cycle?
So honestly, like a chicken tractor, that could be actually somewhat incorporated at the same time you're grazing a particular paddock. So the cattle and the chickens could actually be in the same pasture at the same time. So once you move those cattle out, I'd want to have those chickens there to break the manure pats as quickly as possible, because if you wait too long, those manure pats are going to be a little bit harder for those chickens to actually claw at to break apart. So.
Anything else?